Welcome guys to a very special review. I didn't mention this yesterday because I wasn't sure that I'd be able to get around to doing it today, but thankfully I managed to get a pretty decent amount of sleep last night, and I managed to get up before noon, so I was able to get to the theater, see this movie, come home, write and shoot this review for you guys. I'm very excited about it because I was worried I was going to have to put it off for another week, and I know I never mentioned it, but I did really want to get this review up for you guys because right now this movie is the movie that everyone is talking about. And right now, whether you like this movie or don't like this movie or just don't care about this movie, I think we can all admit that this is a movie that deserves to be talked about because the entire future of a franchise is going to rest on this movie. That being the cinematic franchise for the comic book giant DC Comics, who are at this point branching into an environment that is permeated with Marvel Comics movies. Marvel Comics movies that even at their worst are still pretty favorably reviewed. In fact, the Marvel movies have been this giant of a franchise for so long now that some people legitimately wondered whether or not DC, with content even more iconic than the Marvel content was when they began their cinematic universe, would be able to break into this superhero movie market and take something back for themselves. And keep in mind that this is a DC Comics attempting to break into that market only a relatively short period of time after they made 3 successful Batman movies. And people still worried that they would not be able to take back a part of this market with this movie because of this movie's direct prequel, Man of Steel, a very divisive movie for very legitimate reasons. Now, I have done a review of Man of Steel on my text review site, a link to which will be in the description down below. If you do want to go find that review and check it out, I welcome you to do so. But I'm not going to be mentioning Man of Steel much in this review, so it's not like it's that much of a big deal. I am going to have to mention it a little bit because the aftermath of that movie is a big part of this one. In fact, I'm not sure if this is true or not. What I have heard is that this was just originally going to be a new Batman movie, introducing Batman into the Man of Steel DC cinematic universe, but that the fallout from Man of Steel was so great that the executives meddled in the development of this movie and turned it into a narrative which would deal with that fallout. And it kind of shows a little bit here. I'll talk about that in a minute. But first, let's talk about something that I feel like not a lot of reviewers are actually talking about in regards to this movie. I'll come right out and say it. Just like with Man of Steel, actually, I didn't think this movie was that bad. I'm one of the few people who seem to be a moderate in both cases. I thought Man of Steel had some really good aspects, but I thought it had some really lousy ones. I felt the same way about this movie, and surprise, surprise, it's primarily the same creative team working on this movie as worked on that one. It seemed pretty obvious to me watching this movie that director Zack Snyder really wanted to make a Batman movie. He didn't care all that much about the Superman stuff anymore, and really wanted to make a Batman movie. But even just the aspect of this movie that is Batman versus Superman, I think could have been really, really great if they just left it at that. But there was additional executive meddling that turned Batman vs. Superman into a prequel to the upcoming Justice League movie. Someone somewhere thought that it was a good idea to set up the Justice League, which admittedly is a good idea, but they decided it would be a good idea to do it in this movie, and that's just not true. If they wanted to set up the Justice League before actually bringing them together as the Justice League, they could have done an entire movie entirely on that. This movie proves it. Instead, what you get is a movie called Batman vs. Superman, Dawn of Justice, that feels like 2 movies, Batman vs. Superman and Dawn of Justice, squeezed together into one 2.5-hour mess. There's sloppy editing, bringing these 2 elements together, trying to compile them into a working film when they just don't mesh well. And because they have to be meshed together into this one movie, neither plot is expanded upon as much as it could be, and both plots end up feeling lacking by the end. The Dawn of Justice stuff ends up feeling tacked on, and the Batman vs. Superman stuff ends up feeling really underwhelming, which almost physically hurts me to say. This is Batman fighting Superman. I should not be disappointed by it. Even if it's not handled well, I should still be excited to see them fight. And I was. I just didn't think it amounted to as much as I expected it to. Now, that's not to say that the conflict between Batman and Superman was bad. I had a lot of reservations going into this movie regarding how they were going to handle the conflict between Batman and Superman. They were basing the conflict very heavily on the Dark Knight Returns graphic novel, which is predicated upon Batman and Superman having a very long relationship with each other. These 2 men know each other very well, yet in the universe of this movie, they don't, and quite frankly, I couldn't see how they could take that story that was based upon these men knowing each other very well and translate it to a story where they didn't. Thankfully, I was wrong. They actually did quite a good job of it, what we saw of it anyway, and setting up the Justice League, setting up a universe where there are these other superpowered people besides Superman who are coming into the limelight now because Superman exists, was also handled pretty well when we got to see it. And it really did, for a majority of the movie, feel like every other scene was just a scene from each of these two movies stacked back to back. In fact, I heard another rumor that there's going to be an extended cut DVD release of this movie that's even longer than the theatrical version. And if that's true, I think it could be great, because the two plot lines would actually get a chance to be expanded upon. That said, I didn't think this movie was all that bad, and the reason I don't think it was all that bad is because, simply put, I thought the characters were handled fairly well. For the most part, there were some deficiencies. There was one huge deficiency that I will talk about in a moment. But overall, I thought that it was the characters who carried this movie up until the end when it turned into a summer blockbuster action fest. Let's actually move right on to the characters from this point. Those characters being, of course, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and Lex Luthor. Now, of course, there were other characters in this movie, and they did have some important roles to play, but those are the big ones. Those are the ones I want to touch on here, so I'm just going to touch on them and leave it at that. And we might as well start with the Man of Steel himself, Superman, played by Henry Cavill. Now, I want to make something clear. I think the reason that Man of Steel was such a divisive movie is because Superman is a divisive character. Even Superman fans have very specific expectations regarding how the character is portrayed. And then there are quite a few comic book fans that just don't like Superman at all. I have a friend, in fact, who is not a fan of Superman at all. And he hated this movie because Superman does play a very big part in the narrative, and I don't think it's the best version of Superman we've ever seen by a wide margin, which is not Henry Cavill's fault. He does perfectly fine. He is a little wooden through most of the movie. His performance is a little wooden, but Superman's a fairly stoic guy. Not much gets to him because literally not much gets to him. But there were moments where he really got to shine through as the character and show that he actually can play him really well, and because of that, the film actually portrayed him really well. The issue I have here, though, is Zack Snyder seems to be one of those people who just does not know how to portray Superman. In fact, Zack Snyder seems to be one of those people who just isn't all that gifted at directing people. He's more gifted at directing the scenario, the set, the cinematography. He's better at making a movie look good than feel good. And when you're making a movie about a relatively stoic, untouchable character like Superman, those two things stack on top of each other and create a fairly lackluster performance, unfortunately. It's for that reason that I think if you go into this movie and you're not really a big fan of Superman, you're not going to like it at all. This is not the movie that is finally going to convince you to like Superman. But if you go into the movie fairly indifferent about the character, or you go into the movie as a fan, I think you'd actually really enjoy this film. I mentioned my friend before. I'm a much bigger fan of Superman than he is. I'm still not like a super fan, but I'm a much bigger fan of Superman than he is, and I like the movie a lot more than he did. But regardless of how you feel about Henry Cavill as Superman, it cannot be denied that he did not hold a candle to the next two main actors in this movie, that being Ben Affleck as Batman and Gal Gadot as Wonder Woman. There was actually a poll taken about a week before the movie release of moviegoers who said they did have a desire to see the movie, and I think the figure was 88% of them went to see the movie to see Wonder Woman. And I don't blame them. Wonder Woman is an amazing character who is incredibly underutilized by DC Comics. She has never, up until this point, gotten a big screen adaptation, and that is a huge, huge misstep for the company. She has a large fan base of male and female fans, and DC Comics just lets her sit there as an untapped market. And I've never understood that. Thankfully, though, in this case, they seem to have realized that because Wonder Woman in this movie is great. Gal Gadot plays the character with just the right combination of subtlety and arrogance and eagerness that I never once did not see her in this movie as the character. And this is coming from someone who had very little faith in this casting choice because what I had seen her in before, it hadn't really been stellar. But she looked great as the character, she performed great as the character, and the moment, and I'm not spoiling anything by saying this because it was in the trailers, the moment when she shows up to fight with Batman and Superman against the final threat at the climax of this movie was stunning. It was stunning. The majority of the people in the theater where I was watching this movie cheered when she arrived, in full costume, ready to fight by their sides. And while we didn't get a lot of her here, and while she technically did not need to be in this movie, while if this had been a Batman vs. Superman movie and not a Dawn of Justice movie, they could have easily done without her, I'm glad that she was in this movie. She did not need to be here, but she didn't feel entirely out of place, and I do feel like something would have been lost from the experience if she hadn't been here. But that brings us to Batman, played by Ben Affleck. And I already mentioned that it really felt like Zack Snyder or one of the producers or writers or someone on the production staff of this movie really wanted to make a Batman movie. A more comic book-centric Batman movie than the Dark Knight trilogy ever was or could have been. And it shows. So much of this movie focuses on Batman and his motivations and his drives and his actions, and almost every aspect of the Justice League tie-in ties into Batman and his plotline. And it was very well written. I really enjoyed it. He had some great interplays with some of the other characters. Jeremy Irons as Alfred, for example. They played off of each other perfectly. It felt like banter that had been going on for years and years and years, just like it was supposed to. It was entirely believable. Which I find myself amazed to be saying this, because when Ben Affleck was cast as Batman, just like everybody else, I thought, what are they thinking? Because I still remember Ben Affleck as this guy, who is even more of a joke now because we have this guy. And not once, except maybe the very first instant that his face came up on screen, did Ben Affleck not feel like Bruce Wayne or Batman in this movie. And I say Bruce Wayne or Batman because they are different characters. In order to play Batman, you have to be able to play 3 different characters simultaneously. You have to be able to play Batman. You have to be able to play Bruce Wayne as he actually is outside of the costume. And then you have to be able to play Bruce Wayne as he pretends to be in the public. And Ben Affleck nailed all of them. And as much as this movie did address the fallout from Man of Steel, which is all I'm going to say on the subject because anything else would go into spoiler territory, while this movie did address that fallout from Man of Steel, the only character who really got a true story arc in this movie was Batman. And it really worked really well. Now this is a little predicated on the fact that you do know a little bit about Batman, so you can kind of gauge where he is in his life, in his career as a crime fighter. Otherwise, I think some elements are really going to confuse you, but that does not change the fact that the character was portrayed very, very well. Which brings me to the final of our big 4, Jesse Eisenberg as the Joker. Now, I don't think he was as good as Heath Ledger, but I do think he played a fairly good Joker. He was just the right combination of crazy and manipulative, and I'm pretty sure at this point you know where I'm going. He was not playing Lex Luthor. He played the part that he was hired to play very, very well. But his character was not Lex Luthor. And I know they're justifying this by saying that this is Lex Luthor's son. That his father would have been the Lex Luthor we saw in the comics if all of this stuff had happened during his lifetime. But that doesn't change the fact that if you put him into the same role as Lex Luthor, he still needs to be playing Lex Luthor, and he wasn't. He was an entirely new original character who was channeling too much of the Joker. He was just a little too out there and crazy, and more than any other aspect of this movie, and I mean that literally, I'm including all of the Dawn of Justice tie-in segments, this Lex Luthor felt shoehorned into this narrative. And just like the deficiencies with Superman, I do not blame this on Jesse Eisenberg. I thought he performed the part that they hired him to play very, very well. As I've already said, it was the way this character was written that was at fault. And while, mild spoiler ahead, while it does seem like the end of this movie sets up for him to be on the path to becoming like Lex from the comics, it doesn't make up for this. All of that said, guys, I really didn't have as many issues with this movie as a lot of people did. I actually enjoyed my experience for the most part. Do I wish this had been handled differently? Absolutely. But do I think it's a movie that you will enjoy if you're a comic book fan? Probably. Which brings me to the rating. This is the first time I'm going to do an actual rating in one of my video reviews for a movie. My rating system is a 0 to 10 rating system, going from 0 as absolute garbage, all the way up to 10 being perfection. And I mean perfection not in that it was an absolutely flawless piece, but that it was the most perfect representation of whichever franchise it is trying to be that it could possibly be. And everything in between. That being said, on my rating scale, I rate this movie a 6.5. It is right between an average movie and an above average movie. But guys, if you have seen this movie, let's get a spoiler-free discussion going in the comment section down below. And additionally, if you would like me to do a spoiler-heavy review of this movie, let me know in the comments as well. If I get enough requests, it is something that I'm willing to do. Because believe me, I have a lot more to say about this thing than I already have. Either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys